July 15, 1099, Jerusalem. The Crusaders breached the walls just after noon. By sunset, the streets were running with blood. By the third day, somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 people were dead. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. And the men doing the killing believed they were saving their souls. They fought their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christianity. Still wearing armors soaked in blood, they knelt, they wept, they prayed. They thanked God for their victory. This is what happened when faith stopped being personal and became a weapon. When religious conviction met political ambition. When tens of thousands of people marched 2,500 meters across hostile territory through starvation, disease, and war, convinced that God wanted them to kill. So, how does belief turn into this? What drives ordinary people to commit extraordinary violence? And what does it cost? Before we get into it, if this story grabs you, if you want to understand how history's darkest moments actually unfolded, do me a favor. Hit the like button and drop a comment. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who care about real history, not the sanitized version. I don't skip the ugly parts. I don't make this comfortable. That's what you're here for? Subscribe to Dark History Class. Let's go. This is the First Crusade. 4 years, 3 continents, hundreds of thousands dead. It started with a speech. Here's what happened. November 27, 1095, Clermont, France. A field outside the cathedral. Cold morning air. Crowd gathering since dawn. Pope Urban I stood before thousands of people, clergy, nobles, knights, peasants. This was the final day of the Council of Clermont, a church gathering that had been discussing reform, discipline, internal politics. But Urban had something bigger in mind. He began to speak. The message was simple. Jerusalem, the city where Christ died and rose again, was in the hands of Muslims. Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land were being attacked, robbed, killed. The sacred sites were being defiled. The Byzantine Empire, the Christian empire in the East, was under siege by the Seljuk Turks and desperately needed help. Urban's voice rose. He told them this was a crisis of faith, a test. Christendom was being threatened and good Christians had a duty to act. But then came the promise. If you take up the cross and march to Jerusalem, if you fight to reclaim the Holy Land, your sins will be forgiven completely. Doesn't matter what you've done. Murder, theft, adultery, betrayal, none of it counts. Die on this crusade and you go straight to heaven. Guaranteed salvation. For medieval Europeans, this was everything. Salvation wasn't some abstract concept. It was the difference between eternal paradise and eternal torment, and the church controlled access to it. Except now was offering a shortcut. Fight and you're saved. The crowd erupted. Dios vault! They shouted. God wills it. Men began tearing strips of red cloth and sewing crosses onto their tunics right there in the field. The symbol of commitment. Once you wore the cross, you were bound, backing out meant excommunication, being cut off from the church, from the sacraments, from any hope of salvation. Urban hadn't expected this. He thought he'd recruit a few thousand knights. Instead, he ignited a mass movement. Word spread across Europe like fire through dry grass. Priests and monks carried the message to every village, every town. The call resonated with everyone, but for different reasons. For younger sons of nobles, men who would inherit nothing because of primogeniture laws. This was a chance to carve out land and wealth in the East. For criminals, it was redemption. Take the cross and your crimes were forgiven by both God and the state. For the truly devout, it was the ultimate act of faith, a pilgrimage and a holy war combined. For the desperate and the poor, it was escape. Escape from feudal oppression, from famine, from a life with no prospects. And for the ambitious, it was opportunity, political power, military glory, a chance to become something greater. But why now? Why this moment? Context matters. The Shelyakh Turks, originally nomadic tribes from Central Asia, had converted to Islam and rapidly expanded westward. They conquered Baghdad in 1055, then pushed into Byzantine territory. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they crushed the Byzantine army and captured the emperor. It was a catastrophe. The Byzantines lost most of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, in a single generation. By the 1090s, the Seljuks controlled Jerusalem, which they had taken from the Fatimid Caliphate in 1073. The Fatimids based in Egypt were Shia Muslims. The Seljuks were Sunni. The Islamic world was not unified. It was fractured by theological and political rivalries. But European Christians didn't care about those distinctions. To them, Muslims were Muslims. Emperor Alexios Saraskinos, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, sent envoys to Pope Urban in 1095. The request was simple. Send Pope Urban II's call that ignited a world-on-fire mercenaries. Professional soldiers, a few thousand men to help push back the Turks and reclaim Anatolia. Urban saw something bigger. The Catholic Church in Rome and the Orthodox Church in Constantinople had split in 1054 over theological and political disputes. Urban believed a joint military campaign could heal that rift. It would also channel the endless violence of European knights who spent most of their time fighting each other toward an external enemy. And it would massively expand papal authority. So Urban didn't just ask for soldiers, he launched a holy war. By the summer of 1096, tens of thousands were preparing to march. Not one unified army, but multiple groups led by different nobles. Departure was planned for August, but one group didn't wait. His name was Peter the Hermit, a French monk, charismatic, intense. He claimed Christ had appeared to him during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and commanded him to lead the faithful to reclaim the Holy Land. Whether that vision was real or invented didn't matter. People believed him. Peter began preaching in early 1096, and crowds gathered wherever he went. Unlike the nobles, who were still organizing logistics and supplies, Peter promised immediate action. No waiting, no planning, just faith. By April 1096, he had assembled an army of about 40,000 people. Calling it an army is generous. These were peasants, urban poor, some minor knights, women, children, elderly pilgrims. Almost no military training, no real weapons, no supply chain. Just conviction and desperation. They left in April, months before the official crusade. The plan, if you could call it that, was to march east, pick up support along the way, and arrive in Jerusalem through sheer momentum. It went wrong almost immediately. As the mob moved through the Rhineland, the region along the Rhine River in modern Germany, violence erupted. The logic for those swept up in religious fervor was simple. Why march 2,000 miles to fight enemies of Christ when there are enemies here? They meant the Jews. May through June 1096, the cities of Speyer, Worms, Mounts Cologne. Jewish communities that had lived there for generations were suddenly under attack. Mobs stormed into Jewish quarters. They demanded conversions, accept baptisms, or die. Some converted under threat. Many refused. Entire families were slaughtered. Synagogues were burned. In Mainz alone, estimates suggest over 1,000 Jews were killed in a single day. Local bishops tried to intervene. Some hid Jewish families in their palaces. Some negotiated with the mobs. It rarely worked. The bishops didn't have the armed force to stop thousands of enraged crusaders. This was the first blood of the first Crusade, not shed against Muslim soldiers in a distant land, shed against neighbors. Peter the Hermit's mob continued east, looting and pillaging as they went. They crossed into Hungary, then Byzantine territory. By the time they reached Constantinople in late summer 1096, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the disciplined mercenary force he'd requested. This was a locust swarm. Alexio wanted them gone fast. He provided some supplies and fired them across the Bosporus, the narrow straits separating Europe from Asia, as quickly as possible. Get them out of his city before they caused more damage. The mob entered Anatolia, now in Seljuk Turkish territory. With no reconnaissance and no strategy, they began raiding the countryside, looting villages, attacking isolated fortresses. Small victories fed their confidence. They believed God was protecting them. Then reality arrived. October 21st, 1096. A place called Sovetto, near the city of Nika. The Seljuk Turks, led by Sultan Kilij Arslan, had been watching. They waited until Peter's mob was spread out, disorganized, overconfident. Then they attacked. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Turkish cavalry surrounded the camp at dawn. Horse archers, fast, mobile, deadly, cut through the untrained peasants like a scythe through wheat. There was no formation, no defense, no leadership, just panic. By midday, it was over. Estimates suggest fewer than 3,000 survived out of 40,000. The rest were dead or captured and sold into slavery. Peter the Hermit wasn't there. He'd returned to Constantinople days earlier for supplies. He survived. Almost all his followers did not. The bodies were left where they fell. The Turks piled the bones into a pyramid as a warning. The People's Crusade was annihilated before it even began. But the real crusade, the one led by trained knights and powerful nobles, was still coming, and they were far more dangerous. While Peter the Hermit's peasant army was being destroyed in Anatolia, the real military force was assembling across Europe. These weren't desperate peasants. These were the warrior elite, knights in chainmail and plate armor. Experienced commanders, wealthy nobles who could afford to equip entire retinues of soldiers. The key leaders, Godfrey of Beaune, Duke of Lower Lorraine, pious, disciplined, respected. He sold much of his land to finance the journey, brought his brothers Eustace and Baldwin with him. Bund of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, ambitious, ruthless, brilliant tactician. He'd spent years fighting the Byzantines in the Balkans, and had no loyalty to Emperor Alexios, brought his nephew Tancred, equally capable and equally ruthless. Ramon, IV of Toulouse, Count of Tus, the wealthiest crusader, elderly, deeply religious, brought the largest contingent, possibly 10,000 men, accompanied by Adhemar of Louis, the papal legate, the Pope's personal representative and spiritual leader of the crusade. Robert II of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, mortgaged his doucet to his brother, the King of England, to afford the crusade. Robert II of Flanders, another experienced soldier and lord. Stephen of Blois, wealthy and well-connected. His role becomes important later. Each leader commanded his own army. No unified command structure, no supreme leader, just a loose coalition, held together by shared purpose and mutual suspicion. Total force estimated between 60,000 and 100,000 people, including soldiers. Non-combatant pilgrims, clergy, families, merchants, and camp followers. They took different routes east. Some went overland through Hungary, others through Italy and across the Adriatic. All roads led to Constantinople. By late 1096 and early 1097, they began arriving at the Byzantine capital. Emperor Alexios Komnenos was in a difficult position. He'd asked for help. He needed soldiers to reclaim Byzantine land from the Seljuks. But this wasn't what he expected. This was a massive, barely controlled migration. And the Normans, Beaumont especially, had been his enemies just years earlier. Alexios feared these crusaders might sack Constantinople itself. So he made a demand before he would provide supplies, guides, and transport across the Bosporus into Asia. The leaders had to swear an oath of fealty to him. They had to promise that any land they reconquered that had previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be returned. The negotiations were tense. Beaumont agreed almost immediately. He was pragmatic. He knew he needed Alexios's support. And an oath was just words. He'd break it if necessary. Raymond of Toulouse resisted. He didn't trust Alexios. The theological split between Catholic and Orthodox Christians was still fresh. Raymond saw Alexios as a schismatic, not a true Christian. Eventually, under pressure, he swore a modified oath. Godfrey initially refused, then relented when Alexios cut off his food supplies. The others followed. Alexios, for his part, provided food, money, siege equipment, and military advisors. He also assigned a Byzantine general named Tatikios to accompany the crusade with a small force of Byzantine troops. Officially, Tatikio was there to help. Really, he was there to make sure the crusaders kept their oath. Neither side trusted the other. The Byzantines saw the crusaders as barbaric, unpredictable, dangerous. The crusaders saw the Byzantines as effete, untrustworthy, possibly heretical. It was an alliance built on necessity, not loyalty. By April and May of 1097, the Crusader armies were fed across the Bosporus into Anatolia. Most of these men had never left Europe. Now they were entering a completely foreign world. Different climate, different landscape, different language, different enemy. Their first target was the city of Nika, the same city where Peter the Hermit's peasant army had been destroyed 6 months earlier. The Crusaders marched past the Pyramid of Bones as they approached. Nika was the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, heavily fortified, strategically vital, once a Byzantine city, now the heart of Turkish power in Anatolia. Taking it would send a message. The crusade was serious. Losing it would mean the entire campaign was over before it really began. On May 14, 1097, the Crusader armies arrived at the walls of Nika and began the siege. Nika sat on the eastern shore of a large lake, Lake Iznik. The city's walls were massive, built of stone stretching for miles. It had been a Byzantine city for centuries before the Seljuks took it in 1081. Now it was the seat of Sultan Kila Jarlan. Arlim wasn't there when the Crusaders arrived. He'd underestimated them. After slaughtering Peter, the Hermit's peasant mob so easily at Sivo, he assumed this new group would be the same. Disorganized, untrained, easily crushed. He was wrong. The Crusader army surrounded Nika on 3 sides. The 4th side faced the lake, which meant the defenders could still be resupplied by boat. A full blockade was impossible without controlling the water. On May 16th, 2 days into the siege, Kelejar Selan returned with a relief force. He attacked at dawn, hoping to catch the Crusaders unprepared. His cavalry hit the southern section of the siege line, Raymond of Toulouse camp, hard and fast. But the Crusaders held. Unlike the peasant mob, these were trained soldiers. They formed shield walls, locked ranks, and fought in disciplined units. The Turkish horse archers, devastating in open terrain, couldn't break through. The battle raged for hours. Losses were heavy on both sides. By midday, Arsalan realized he wasn't facing amateurs. He withdrew, taking his wounded and dead with him. The Crusaders had won their first real engagement, but the city still held. The siege continued for another month. The Crusaders built siege engines, bombarded the walls, tried to mine under the fortifications. The defenders responded with sorties, ambushes, and constant harassment. Then Emperor Alexios intervened. He sent a fleet of ships overland, literally dragged across land on rollers, and launched them on Lake Iznik. The Byzantine navy cut off the city's water supply line. On June 19th, the Turkish garrison decided to surrender. But here's where things got complicated. The garrison negotiated secretly with Alexios, not with the Crusaders. They surrendered directly to Byzantine forces. When the Crusaders woke up, on the morning of June 19th, they saw Byzantine banners flying from the walls of Nika. Rage swept through the camp. The Crusaders had done the fighting. They'd lost hundreds of men. They'd spent a month in brutal siege conditions. And now the Byzantines, who had barely participated, were claiming the city, and with it, all the loot. Looting a captured city was standard practice. It's how soldiers got paid. Denying them, that was a betrayal. Alexios, sensing mutiny, acted quickly. He paid the Crusader leaders in gold and distributed money to the soldiers. It wasn't as much as they would have gotten from sacking the city, but it was enough to prevent open revolt. Still, the resentment lingered. The alliance between the Crusaders and Byzantines, already fragile, cracked a little more. On June 26th, the crusade resumed. The next target was Antioch, over 500 meters to the southeast. But first, they had to cross Anatolia. The army split into two groups for easier supply management. The vanguard, led by Beaumont, Tancred, and other Norman leaders, marched ahead. The rearguard, led by Raymond Godfrey and the others, followed about a day's march behind. It was a practical decision. Two smaller columns could forage more effectively than one massive army, but it was also risky. If one group was attacked, the other might not arrive in time to help. Clermont was watching. Eddy July 1st, 1097, a place called Adrium in central Anatolia dawn. The Norman vanguard was preparing to break camp when the attack came. Turkish cavalry poured over the hills. Thousands of them, horse archers, fast and mobile, using tactics the Crusaders had never seen before. They didn't charge directly into the Crusader line. Instead, they circled, firing arrows in waves, retreating before the Crusaders could close distance, then circling again. It was devastating. Horses screamed and collapsed. Men fell with arrows in their throats, their chests, their legs. The Normans tried to charge, but the Turks just rode away, out of reach, then turned and fired again. Bohemond, recognizing the danger, ordered his forces into a defensive circle. Shields up, facing outward, protecting the non-combatants, pilgrims, women, children who were trapped inside the formation. They held barely 4 hours. The arrows kept coming. Men died. Horses died. Supplies burned. Morale collapsed. Owen sent riders to Raymond. Get here now, or we're all dead. Late morning, the horizon changed. Raymond's column appeared, marching at full speed. Banners raised, armor gleaming, thousands of fresh soldiers. The Turks, who had been focused entirely on destroying. Bohemond's force suddenly found themselves caught between two armies. The Crusader, heavy cavalry, knights in full armor on war horses charged. At close range, they were unstoppable. The weight, the speed, the shock of impact. Turkish light cavalry couldn't stand against it. Clermont's army broke. The retreat turned into a rout. The Crusaders pursued, cutting down anyone they could catch. By afternoon, the Turkish camp was overrun. The Crusaders looted everything. Gold, horses, weapons, food, tents, victory. Total decisive victory. But it cost them. Hundreds dead, many more wounded. Horses critical for mobility, lost by the dozens. And Clermont, humiliated twice now, changed his strategy. If he couldn't defeat the Crusaders in battle, he'd starve them. He began scorching the earth after Doriam Keelan ordered every village, every farm, every well along the Crusaders' route destroyed. Burn the crops, poison the wells, drive the livestock into the mountains, leave nothing. The Crusaders marched into a wasteland. July and August 1097, the height of summer in central Anatolia. Temperatures soaring above 100 F, no shade, no water sources, no food. The suffering was immediate. Horses started dying first. Without water, they collapsed by the hundreds. Knights, men who had trained their entire lives to fight on horseback, were suddenly on foot, carrying armor that weighed 50 to 60 pounds in crushing heat. Some tried to ride oxen. It looked absurd, but desperation erases pride. Then the people started dying. Non-combatants, pilgrims who had joined the crusade for spiritual reasons. Elderly men and women, children couldn't keep up. They fell behind and were left. There was no choice. The army couldn't stop. Soldiers began eating their pack animals. Then their leather belts, their shoes, anything that could be chewed. Some resorted to drinking their own urine or their horse's blood. Contemporary chroniclers, priests, and monks traveling with the crusade wrote about finding bodies every few hundred yards. They stopped counting after a while. Estimates suggest thousands died during this march. No one knows the exact number. Recordkeeping collapses when survival becomes the only priority. Discipline broke down. Soldiers looted each other. Fights erupted over scraps of food. Desertion increased. Men slipped away at night, hoping to make it back to Constantinople, though most didn't. The leaders Beaumont, Raymond, Godfrey struggled to maintain any semblance of order. They couldn't inspire men who were dying of thirst. They couldn't punish desertion when half the army was considering it. By early September, the crusade was on the edge of total collapse. Then the landscape began to change. They entered northern Syria. The terrain turned greener. Rivers appeared. Villages still inhabited could be raided for supplies. The relief was overwhelming. Men wept when they saw the first river. They drank until they vomited, then drank again. The crusade had survived, barely. But the army that limped into northern Syria in September 1097 is not the same force that had left Nika in June. It was smaller, weaker, traumatized, and ahead of them lay Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, heavily fortified, fully garrisoned, and absolutely essential. If you're still watching, drop a comment. What would you have done? Turned back after Anatolia or kept going? And if this kind of raw, unfiltered history is what you want, subscribe. We're just getting started. On October 21st, 1097, the Crusader army arrived at the walls of Antioch. What they saw was terrifying. Antioch was enormous. The walls stretched for miles, climbing up the slopes of Mount Silius, wrapping around the city like a stone serpent. There were over 400 towers built into those walls. 400. Each one manned, each one defensible. The city had been one of the great centers of early Christianity. St. Peter himself had preached here. The first followers of Christ were called Christians in Antioch. But that was 1,000 years ago. Now it was held by the Seljuk Turks, governed by a commander named Yaki. He was experienced, well-supplied, and fully aware the Crusaders were coming. When the Crusader army arrived on October 21st, 1097, they faced an immediate problem. They didn't have enough men to surround the city. Antioch was too large. The Crusader force, already reduced by death and desertion, couldn't form a complete blockade. That meant the defenders could still receive supplies from the east. Food, weapons, reinforcements, all flowing into the city while the Crusaders sat outside, exposed. The leaders held a council. The options were brutal. Storm the walls. Suicide. The defenses were too strong. The garrison too large. Bypass Antioch and march on to Jerusalem. Politically impossible, Antioch controlled the road south. Leaving it behind meant a hostile force at their backs and no secure supply line. Besiege it and wait for starvation to do the work. The only realistic option, but it would take months, maybe longer. They chose the siege. October turned to November. The weather changed, rain came. The Crusader camp sprawled across the plains outside the city turned into a mud-soaked nightmare. They had no permanent shelters. Tents leaked. Firewood was scarce. Men slept in cold, wet clothes and woke up shivering, and the food started running out. Foraging parties went out daily, scouring the countryside for anything edible. The locals had already fled or hidden their supplies. What little the Crusaders found, they fought over. By December, starvation set in. Soldiers were eating grass, roots, tree bark, leather straps boiled into a vile soup. Horses and mules were slaughtered for meat until there were almost none left. The non-combatants, pilgrims, elderly, the sick died first. Hundreds every week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Disease spread. Typhus, infections from minor wounds that turned fatal. Adhemar of Leui, the Papal Leoi, tried to maintain morale through prayer and ritual. Daily masses, processions, sermons about suffering as a test of faith. It barely worked. Desertion increased. Men slipped away at night, heading back toward Constantinople. Hoping to survive the journey, most didn't. Peter the Hermit, the same monk who had led the peasant crusade to disaster at Sivo, was with the army now. In late December, he tried to flee. He was caught and dragged back to camp in disgrace. Then, in January 1098, one of the most powerful leaders broke. Stephen of Blois, wealthy, well-connected, commanding a significant contingent, announced he was leaving. He claimed illness. Everyone knew it was fear. He took his men and marched back toward Constantinople. His departure shattered morale. If one of the richest and most respected nobles was abandoning the crusade, why should anyone else stay? The remaining leaders argued constantly. Raymond wanted to hold the siege. Bund wanted to negotiate. Others whispered about retreat. There was no unified command, no clear strategy, just slow grinding attrition. Then, in March 1098, something changed. A fleet of English ships landed at the port of San Simeon about 12 miles from Antioch. They brought timber, weapons, and most importantly, food. The camp erupted in relief. Men wept. They gorged themselves until they were sick, then ate. More morale rebounded slightly, but Yagi still held Antioch. And worse, intelligence reached the Crusaders that a massive Turkish relief army was assembling in the east. Kaboga, the Attab of Mosul, was gathering forces from across the region. Estimates put his army at 40,000 men, maybe more. If Kaboga arrived before Antioch fell, the Crusaders would be caught between the city and the relief force. They'd be annihilated. The siege had been going for 6 months. The Crusaders were exhausted, starving, disease-ridden. They couldn't take much more. Bowand of Taranto saw the situation clearly. Antioch wouldn't fall by siege. It had to fall by betrayal. And he'd been working on exactly that. Beaumont had been talking to someone inside the city. His name was Firuz, an Armenian Christian who had converted to Islam and now served as a guard commander in Antioch. He controlled a section of the wall. 3 towers, known collectively as the Tower of the Two Sisters. Why Firus agreed to betray the city is unclear. Some sources say Yagi Khan had insulted him. Others suggest Bund paid him. Maybe Firus had Christian sympathies and saw the Crusaders as liberators. Maybe he just wanted to survive. Whatever the reason, Firus agreed to let the Crusaders in. Bowand, always calculating, saw an opportunity not just to take the city, but to claim it for himself. He went to the other leaders with a proposal. If I deliver Antioch, I keep it. Raymond of Toulouse objected immediately. He wanted Antioch for himself, or at least to honor the oath they'd all sworn to Alexios and return it to the Byzantine Empire. The others were torn, but the situation was desperate. Kaboga's relief army was days away. They didn't take Antioch. Now they'd lose everything. Reluctantly, they agreed. Beaumont could have the city if he could take it. On the night of June 2, 1098, Beaumont executed the plan. A small group, maybe 60 knights, approached the section of wall controlled by Firuz. They carried ladders, no torches, complete silence. Fews lowered ropes. The knights climbed, one by one. They reached the top of the wall and secured the towers. Then they opened a nearby gate. Horns sounded the signal. The entire Crusader army, waiting in the darkness, surged forward. They poured into Antioch in a flood of iron and rage. The streets erupted in chaos. Defenders scrambled to respond, half asleep, disorganized. Crusaders kicked down doors, dragged people into the streets, killed anyone who resisted. Yagi Ken, realizing the city was lost, fled on horseback with a small group of guards. He didn't make it far. Local peasants found him, recognized him, and killed him. His head was brought back to the Crusaders as a trophy. By dawn on June 3rd, Antioch belonged to the Crusaders. They looted everything: homes, markets, mosques, churches. The city's Muslim population was slaughtered. Many Christians, Greek Orthodox and Armenian, were killed in the confusion, mistaken for enemies, or simply caught in the violence. The soldiers, starving for months, found the city's food stores and gorged themselves. Wine flowed. For the first time in half a year, they felt human again. Beaumont claimed the citadel and raised his banner. Antioch was his. The celebration lasted 2 days. On June 5, 1098, scouts came running into the city with news that turned triumph into terror. Koga had arrived. His army, estimated at 40,000 strong, surrounded Antioch completely. Every gate, every road, every escape route. The besieges were now the besieged. The Crusaders, who had just fought their way into the city, were now trapped inside it, and they'd already eaten most of the food during their 2-day celebration. June 5th to June 28th, 23 days of hell. The starvation that had plagued the Crusaders outside the walls was now worse inside. Kaboga's blockade was complete. Nothing got in, nothing got out. Men ate the horses they just captured. Then the dogs, then rats, then leather, belts, shoes, saddles boiled until soft enough to chew. Some tried to escape by climbing down ropes at night. Many died in the attempt. Those who survived were hunted down by Turkish patrols. Morale disintegrated. Soldiers spoke openly of surrender. Some claimed it would be better to die fighting than to starve slowly. Then more bad news arrived. Emperor Alexios, who had promised support, was marching south with a Byzantine army. But on the road, he encountered Stephen of Blois, the noble who had deserted back in January. Stephen told Alexios the crusade was doomed. Antioch would fall. The Crusaders would be slaughtered. There was no point in continuing. Alexios, hearing this from a first-hand source, made a decision. He turned his army around and went back to Constantinople. The siege of Jerusalem. God's will or humanity's fall. When word reached the Crusaders in Antioch, the last thread of trust between them and the Byzantines snapped. They were alone, surrounded, starving, abandoned. Defeat seemed certain. Then a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed he'd had a vision. Peter Bartholomew was nobody, a poor pilgrim, uneducated, unremarkable. But on June 14, 1098, he approached the Crusader leaders with an extraordinary claim. St. Andrew, one of Christ's apostles, had appeared to him in a vision multiple times. The saint revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. It was buried, Peter said, beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. The leaders were skeptical, especially Adhemar of Lay, the papal Leo, who knew church history well enough to know the Holy Lance was supposed to be in Constantinople, not Antioch. But the soldiers believed, or wanted to believe, they needed something, anything, to cling to. On June 15th, they began digging in the cathedral. They dug for hours. Nothing. The heat was unbearable, the work exhausting. Doubt crept in. Then, Peter Bartholomew himself jumped into the pit and moments later emerged holding a spearhead. The crowd erupted. Men fell to their knees. They wept. They prayed. They reached out to touch the spear, convinced it was genuine. Was it real? Probably not. The most likely explanation: Peter planted it beforehand. But in that moment, truth didn't matter. Belief did. Overnight morale transformed. The Crusaders went from broken and defeated to fanatical. They believed God had given them a sign. They were destined to win. The leaders, seeing the change, made a decision. They would fight, not wait for rescue, not negotiate. Surrender. Fight. On June 28, 1098, at dawn, the gates of Antioch opened. The Crusader army marched out in battle formation, organized in two divisions, each led by one of the major nobles. They were starving, outnumbered, outmatched, but they carried the Holy Lance at the front, and they believed they were invincible. Kaba's army was larger and better supplied. Its coalition included heirs from Mosul, Aleppo, Damascus, and others. On paper, the Crusaders had no chance. But coalitions are fragile. Kaboga's emir didn't fully trust each other. There were rivalries, disputes over command, resentment about who would get credit for the victory. The unity was surface level. When the Crusaders charged, not with caution, but with absolute conviction, cracks appeared. The Turkish line wavered, then broke. Rumors spread through Koga's ranks. The Crusaders were being aided by heavenly warriors, saints on white horses fighting alongside them. The rumors were nonsense, but in the chaos of battle, they felt real. Panic set in. Units began retreating without orders. The retreat turned into a rout. Koga tried to rally his forces, but the collapse was total. By midday, his army was fleeing east, abandoning their camp, their supplies. Their wounded, the Crusaders pursued, cutting down anyone they caught. Then they turned to the camp and looted everything: tents, food, weapons, gold, horses. It was a complete impossible victory. The Crusaders had been trapped, starving on the edge of annihilation, and they'd won. In their minds, there was only one explanation: God. The Holy Lance had delivered. Their faith had been rewarded. They were the instruments of divine will. But the crusade didn't resume immediately. Bowman declared Antioch his. As agreed, Ramon disputed it, arguing the city should go to Alexios, per the original oath, or to himself. The argument dragged on for months. Other leaders took sides. Factions formed. Meanwhile, disease swept through Antioch. A plague, possibly. Typhoid killed thousands. On August 1st, 1098, Adhemar of Louis, the spiritual anchor of the entire crusade, died. His loss was devastating. Connemar had been the one figure who could mediate disputes, who commanded respect from all sides. Without him, the leadership fractured further. Months passed. The crusade sat idle while the nobles argued over politics. The rank-and-file soldiers, those who had survived everything so far, grew furious. They hadn't marched 2,000 miles, endured starvation and battle to sit in Antioch while their leaders squabbled over power. By late 1098, they threatened mutiny. March to Jerusalem, or we go without you. Finally, in January 1099, the leaders relented. The crusade would continue. Bowman stayed behind as Prince of Antioch, the first Crusader estate. The rest marched south toward Jerusalem. January 1099. The crusade resumed. The army that left Antioch was smaller than the one that had arrived. Boone stayed behind with his garrison. Thousands had died from disease during the long stall. Others had deserted or simply couldn't continue. Estimates put the remaining force at around 15,002 to 20,000 total, including non-combatants of Quittle. Those, perhaps 1/200th to 2,500, were knights. The rest were infantry and support. They marched south along the Mediterranean coast. The strategy was simple: stay near the ports. Ships could bring supplies from Cyprus and Italy to a safer then, marching inland through hostile territory. As they moved through what is now Lebanon and northern Israel, they encountered local Muslim rulers. Most chose negotiation over battle. The Crusaders were clearly dangerous, but they were also just passing through. So the emir made deals. Food, here's gold. Keep moving and don't burn our cities. The Crusaders accepted. They needed supplies more than conquest at this point, but not everyone cooperated. In February 1099, they reached the city of Arca near modern Tripoli. Raymond of Toulouse wanted it. He saw an opportunity to carve out his own territory just like Beaumont had done with Antioch. The other leaders resisted. Godfrey, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders. They all argued for pushing straight to Jerusalem. That was the goal. That was what they promised. Raymond ignored them and began a siege. It was a disaster. Arca was well defended and well supplied. The siege dragged on for weeks, then months. Nothing was accomplished. Men died for no gain. And during the siege, Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who had discovered the Holy Lance, began losing credibility. Disputes arose about the lance's authenticity. Adhemar of Louis had been skeptical before his death, and others were voicing doubts. Peter, desperate to prove himself, volunteered for a trial by ordeal. On April 8, 1099, a massive fire was built. 2 walls of flame with a narrow path between. Them Peter Bartholomew, carrying the Holy Lance, walked through. He emerged on the other side, badly burned. He died 12 days later from his injuries. The Holy Lance, which had seemed like divine proof just months earlier, was now questioned by nearly everyone. Faith, it turned out, was as fragile as flesh. By May, even Raymond admitted the siege of Arca was pointless. On May 13th, he lifted it. The army marched on. They moved down the coast, past Beirut, past Sidon, past Tyre. Some cities paid tribute, others just watched them pass, unwilling to risk a fight. By early June, the Crusaders were in striking distance of their goal. On June 7, 1099, they crested a line of hills and saw it, Jerusalem. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers fell to their knees. Some wept openly. Others stood frozen, staring. Priests began singing hymns. Men who had marched for nearly 4 years, who had watched friends and brothers die, who had suffered through starvation and disease and battle. They were looking at the reason for all of it. The holy city, the place where Christ was crucified and resurrected, the goal of their pilgrimage. It was real. It was right there. But Jerusalem was not undefended. The city was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, the Shia Muslim power based in Egypt. They had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks just a year earlier in 1098, while the Crusaders were stuck at Antioch. The Fatimid governor, Ikar Adallah, knew the Crusaders were coming. He'd been preparing for months. He expelled the Christian population, didn't want a potential 5th column inside the walls. He poisoned the wells and springs outside the city, He stockpiled food, weapons, and water inside. He reinforced the garrison. Jerusalem was ready. The Crusaders were not. They had no siege equipment, no reliable water source nearby. The nearest spring was miles away, and it was heavily guarded. No time. Intelligence indicated a Fatimid relief army was assembling in Egypt and would arrive within weeks. And they were exhausted. The leaders called a council. The debate was brief. The leaders called a council. The debate was brief. There was no real choice. They had to take Jerusalem. Now, on June 13, 1099, the Crusaders launched their first assault. The first assault was desperate and disorganized. The Crusaders didn't have siege towers or battering rams. They had ladders, wooden ladders hastily constructed from whatever timber they could scavenge. They placed the ladders against the walls and climbed. The defenders were ready. Arrows came first, hundreds of them shot from the walls and towers. Then stones, then boiling oil poured from the ramparts onto anyone climbing below. Some Crusaders made it to the top of the walls. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out on the narrow ramparts, swords clashing, men grappling, bodies falling, but there weren't enough ladders, not enough men reaching the walls at the same time. The defenders concentrated their forces at each ladder, overwhelming the climbers one by one. By midday, the assault had collapsed. The Crusaders retreated, dragging their wounded. Hundreds were dead. Nothing had been gained. The reality was clear. They couldn't take Jerusalem by simple assault. The walls were too strong, the defenders too prepared. A war council convened that night. The leaders were divided, as always. But they agreed on one thing. They needed siege equipment, trooper equipment, towers that could reach the height of the walls, rams that could break the gates. The problem? There was almost no timber in the area. Jerusalem sat in arid hills, no forests, no large trees. Then on June 17th, salvation arrived. 6 ships, Genoese and English, landed at the port of Jaffa, about 40 miles northwest. They carried supplies, weapons, and most critically skilled engineers and timber. The timber was unloaded and transported overland to Jerusalem under heavy guard. Fatimid forces from Jaffa's garrison tried to intercept it. They failed. Construction began immediately. The chief engineer was a Genoese man named Guglielmo Embrico, William Gell Embria. He supervised the building of 2 massive siege towers and several battering rams. The towers were 3 stories tall, sheathed in animal hides soaked in water to resist fire. Each one could hold dozens of soldiers. A drawbridge at the top would drop onto the wall, allowing the Crusaders to pour directly onto the ramparts. Building them took a month. Meanwhile, the Crusaders suffered. It was summer. The heat was brutal. Water had to be carried from springs miles away, and the routes were constantly harassed by Fatimic raids. Men rationed water carefully. Some died of dehydration. Morale was fragile. They were so close, but the city still seemed impossible. The priests and clergy organized religious processions to maintain faith. On July 8th, the entire Crusader army marched barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem, carrying relics and banners, singing hymns. The defenders on the walls mocked them. Some urinated over the side. Others held up crosses and desecrated them in full view. The Crusaders watched in silence, then returned to camp and prepared for the final assault. On July 13th, scouts brought urgent news. The Fatimid relief army had left Cairo. It was marching north. Estimated arrival, 10 days, maybe less. If Jerusalem didn't fall before that army arrived, the Crusaders would be caught between the city and a fresh force of 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers. Everything depended on the next few days. The night of July 14th, the siege towers were moved into position under cover of darkness. One on the north wall, commanded by Godfrey of Boan, one on the south, commanded by Raymond of Toulouse, at dawn on July 15, 1099. The final assault began. The towers rolled forward, pushed by hundreds of men. Defenders shot fire arrows, trying to ignite the hides. The crusaders extinguished the flames and kept pushing. Stones were hurled from the walls. One of Raymond's engines was hit and damaged. It slowed, but didn't stop. Godfrey's tower reached the north wall first. The drawbridge dropped with a crash, slamming onto the rampart. Knights poured across. Godfrey himself was among the first. Swords out, shields up. They crashed into the defenders. The fighting on the wall was savage. Close quarters, no room to maneuver, just hacking and stabbing and pushing. More crusaders climbed up behind the first wave. The defenders, overwhelmed, began to retreat. Then one of the crusaders, some sources say it was a knight named Leold, ran along the wall to a nearby gate and began attacking the mechanisms from the inside. The gate opened. Crusaders on the ground surged through. Hundreds, then thousands flooding into the city. The defense collapsed. Defenders retreated toward the Temple Mount, the raised platform in the southeastern part of the city, site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. They tried to make a stand there. It didn't matter. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and the Crusaders were beyond reason. By early afternoon, organized resistance had ended, and then the killing began. If you're still here watching this, understanding what faith can become when it stops asking questions, subscribe. Share this. History doesn't get easier from here. It gets harder, and we need to remember it exactly as it was. What happened next is one of the darkest moments in medieval history. There was no mercy. The Crusaders moved through Jerusalem street by street, house by house, killing everyone they found. Muslim civilians, Jewish families, even some Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox and Armenians were killed by Crusaders who couldn't tell the difference or didn't care. The Jewish community had taken refuge in their main synagogue, barricading the doors. The Crusaders surrounded the building, piled wood against the walls, and set it on fire. Everyone inside burned to death. Contemporary accounts written by the Crusaders themselves, not their enemies, described the scale of slaughter in graphic terms. One chronicler, Raymond of Aguilar, who was there, wrote, "Men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." Another account describes the Temple Mount, which area as so covered in blood and bodies that you couldn't walk without stepping on corpses. These descriptions are almost certainly exaggerations. But even if you cut the claims in half, the reality is horrifying. Modern estimates of the death toll range from 10,000 to 40,000. The exact number is impossible to know because no one recorded Jerusalem's population before the siege. The city had been under multiple conquests in recent years. Seljuks, then Fatimids, then Crusaders. Population figures were never reliable. What's certain, thousands of unarmed civilians were killed over the course of 3 days. The Crusaders believed they were purifying the city, cleansing it of defilement, restoring it to its rightful state as a Christian holy site. In their minds, this wasn't murder. It was sanctification. There was one exception to the slaughter. Iftikhar Adallah, the Fatimid governor, had retreated with his bodyguard to the Tower of David, the citadel on the western side of the city. It was the most defensible position in Jerusalem. Raymond of Toulouse's forces surrounded it. Iftikhar negotiated surrender in exchange for handing over the citadel intact. He and his men would be granted safe passage to the coast. Raymond agreed. He escorted them personally out of the city. Iftikhar and his bodyguard were the only Muslims in Jerusalem who survived. By July 17th, the killing had stopped. The Crusaders gathered at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to be where Christ was buried and resurrected. It had been their destination for 4 years. They entered the church still wearing blood-soaked armor. They knelt, they wept, they prayed. They gave thanks to God for granting them victory. Outside, the streets were filled with bodies. The smell was overwhelming. Flies swarmed. Survivors, those few who had hidden and avoided pin detection, emerged slowly, terrified. The Crusaders had done what they came to do. They had taken Jerusalem. The cost was a city drowned in blood. On July 22, 1099, 1 week after the sack, the Crusader leaders met in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to decide who would rule Jerusalem. The choice was politically explosive. Everyone wanted it. No one wanted to give it to someone else. Raymond of Toulouse refused to even be considered. He declared he would not wear a crown in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. It sounded pious. It was also strategic. He knew accepting would make him a target. After days of negotiation, they chose Godfrey of Bourbon. Godfrey accepted but refused the title King of Jerusalem. Instead, he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. A humbler designation still meant he was in charge. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was born. It would survive barely for another 192 years until the fall of Acre in 1291. But in July 1099, that future was uncertain because almost no one stayed. Of the thousands who had fought their way to Jerusalem, only about 300 knights and 2,000 infantry remained to defend it. The rest left immediately. Their pilgrimage was complete, their sins forgiven. They wanted to go home. Those who returned to Europe were treated as heroes. Songs were written about them. They were given land, titles, honor. Churches celebrated their return. Some became legends in their own lifetimes. Those who had abandoned the crusade earlier, like Stephen of Blois, faced the opposite: mockery, scorn. Stephen's own wife publicly shamed him for cowardice. The church threatened excommunication. He eventually went back on the crusade of 1101, partly to restore his honor. He died in battle. The First Crusade succeeded in its stated goal. Jerusalem was retaken. A Christian kingdom was established in the heart of the Middle East, but the cost was staggering. Death toll estimates for the entire First Crusade from 1096 to 1099, all sides combined, range between 1 and 3 million people. Exact numbers are impossible. Record dipping in medieval warfare was inconsistent at best. What we know, the road from Clermont to Jerusalem was built on corpses. The legacy is complicated. The Crusades continued for 2 centuries, 8 major campaigns, dozens of smaller ones. The initial success of the First Crusade convinced European leaders that holy war worked, that God was on their side, that conquest could be justified with Scripture. It deepened the divide between Christianity and Islam in ways that echo into the present. It introduced the concept of religiously justified violence on an industrial scale. It established a precedent that belief could justify nearly anything. For the Islamic world, the Crusades became a defining memory. Invasion, betrayal, massacre by foreigners claiming divine mandate. The First Crusade succeeded. They took Jerusalem. They built a kingdom. And they did it by turning faith into a weapon and certainty into slaughter. If this video challenged what you thought you knew, if it made you think differently about how religion and violence intersect, then it did what it was supposed to do. Subscribe to Dark History Class. We don't sanitize the past. We don't make it comfortable. We tell it exactly as it was. Brutal, complicated, human. Share this video if you think others need to see it. Comment with your thoughts. What drives this kind of violence? Can faith ever be separated from the people who wield it? History doesn't give easy answers, but it gives us the questions we need to ask.